Welcome back to the show. Well, the International Monetary Fund is predicting that the United Kingdom will be one of the worst performing economies in the world this year. It says that the UK will be the lowest among the 20 biggest economies. That includes sanctions hit Russia. Despite having the biggest bounce back of the G7 countries after the pandemic, the UK economy has seen little growth so far in 2023. MPs return to Westminster tomorrow, so should economic reform be top of their to-do list? Well, Vicky Pryce is an economist and business consultant for the Centre for Economic and Business Research, and Julian Jessop is an independent economist, and they both join me now. Vicky, if I could start with you, perhaps you could explain to our viewers and listeners why the IMF forecast is important, and should we be paying attention to it?
I think everyone does pay attention to what the IMF says. Of course, they look at a variety of countries, so they have a global perspective. And you would imagine, therefore, that they have some inside knowledge, if you like, of what makes economies tick. And what they are concerned about is that the UK in particular has been affected in all sorts of different ways to other economies. First of all, we do tend to rely an awful lot of imported gas, and gas prices went up very significantly, of course, over the last year or so. They come down, of course, now. Yes, of course, Germany is also dependent on gas from Russia. So Germany is also not expected to do very well this year. In fact, drop of 0.1%, which is interesting in itself. In addition, though, what the IMF think is that we've got skill shortages, staff shortages, which have led to higher costs for businesses. And we've also, as a result, have had higher inflation, and interest rates are staying higher than would otherwise be the case. So all this is bringing, this slowdown in the economy again after, indeed, the bounce back that you mentioned. And I need to just add that this bounce back is good news, of course, good news for employment in particular. We had very low unemployment in the UK, but unfortunately, we've only just managed to get back to pre-pandemic levels, whereas quite a lot of our competitors in the continent, and of course, all the G7, had been back to pre-pandemic levels a lot earlier than us.
And Julian, I just want to turn to you now, because the Chancellor has said that he doesn't accept what the International Monetary Fund forecasters had to say. Do they always get it right, or are they sometimes wrong?
Well, I mean, these are economic forecasts, and both Vicky and I have been economic forecasters in the past, and we know that you shouldn't put too much faith in these sorts of numbers. Indeed, I'd actually go a bit further than and say that the IMF numbers already look wrong. So based on the data we already have for 2023, in order for their forecast to be right, then the economy, frankly, would have to collapse in the second half of the year. And I don't see any good reason for that to happen, or at least if it does happen, it would be for reasons that would hit other economies even harder. So I wouldn't put too much faith, if any, in the IMF numbers. But I agree with Vicky that there are some underlying problems in the UK economy that do need to be addressed. One is the high level of energy prices, which is now the key reason why our inflation is higher than in many other countries. But there are other problems bubbling below the surface as well, in particular the increases in corporation taxes, so taxes on businesses this year. One of the very few economies to be thinking that now is a good time to be raising taxes, particularly taxes that will hold back investment.
Well, Julian, I noticed in a tweet that you sent out that you were making comments in relation to corporation tax in the context of Ireland's growth, because, as you know, the New Statesman actually have been saying that Ireland is booming while Brexit Britain is whimpering next door. Do you think that the corporation tax levels in the Republic of Ireland play a role in that assessment?
Well, I mean, first of all, that New Statesman article is one of the worst articles, the worst piece of data analysis I've seen for many, many years. It makes the basic error of taking the headline Irish GDP numbers seriously. And this is quite a technical issue, but the key point is they're distorted by the activities of multinationals. So even the Irish themselves don't believe those numbers. They present alternative figures. So the New Statesman analysis was completely misleading. The one thing it did get right is that Ireland has benefited from low corporate taxes, but even then, not as much as some of the headline figures suggest. If you look at household incomes and household spending in Ireland, they're still relatively low. So that has probably helped in some ways, but it hasn't necessarily fed through to higher household incomes and spending, which ultimately is what really matters.
Absolutely. And I have been always looking from a Northern Ireland perspective at the corporation tax in the Republic of Ireland. There was a time when we in Northern Ireland were pushing very hard to have the power to lower corporation tax so that we could come down to that level as well. Because, of course, Vicky, having a low corporation tax allows you to go out into the world and to bring in foreign direct investment into your country. And of course, for Northern Ireland, that would have been something that would have been very, very useful. I mean, how do you view what's going on in relation to corporation tax here in the UK?
Well, the interesting thing about corporation tax is that there's been an attempt internationally to make sure there is a minimum level of corporation tax, particularly for multinationals, and quite a lot of countries, and I believe it was probably Ireland as well, were objecting to that initially, but they've all agreed, but nothing has happened so far as I can see. So there is a bit of competition going on in terms of who's going to have the lower corporation tax so that they can attract forward inward direct investment. And you're absolutely right to mention that. That is one of the factors that people are looking at. But what also is important for any decision is a bit of certainty in the policies. And I think one of the problems we have right now in the UK is that those policies are not looking sort of as if they will be sustainable in the future. So we have too many changes and too many things are left to the last minute before they're either changed or, in fact, announced. So there was a lot of speculation as to whether the corporation tax increase from 19% to 25% would happen at the time of the budget. In the end, it did, even though there was a huge amount of lobbying going on. Now, of course, companies need to make some profit before they pay the corporation tax. So the question is, how many companies are now in difficulty? And I think particularly among the SMEs, it's a very large number. But also I think that on the tax front, we've got a very substantial increase in stealth taxes for individuals. And I think that's another of the problems that the UK is facing by comparison to other countries where, millions are now being pushed into paying tax for the first time or even paying the higher tax. And just one quick thing about what Julian said about forecasts. He's quite right. We always get it wrong. But the government's own forecasters, by which I mean the Office for Budget Responsibility, had a similar drop in GDP for the UK in 2023 when they published their own forecasts with the budget in the middle of March. So, yes, we can dismiss both, but it's not as if one perhaps can be more right than the other.
I'm very interested in what you say about stability of taxes, because for as long as I can remember being in politics in Northern Ireland and now out of politics in Northern Ireland, the Republic had that 12.5% rate of corporation tax. They have never moved it. And then having easy to understand tax rates as well is very important, is it not, to know if you're going to invest or you're going to spend in the UK. But I'm just interested, Vicky, as to the purpose of the IMF forecast. Do you think they're there to try and regulate policy across the world? Am I maybe being too conspiratorial in all of that? Or is this just them saying, here's what we think is going to happen?
I think it's very much the second. But of course, what they do is they always give you scenarios, and they say that things could go wrong in the future. In particular, we've had the banking crisis, of course. We have a very big financial sector here. We probably need to regulate that sector a little bit more. And what they are concerned about is that, in fact, world growth may be even slower than what they're anticipating, because lending may just stop, or at least be considerably lower in terms of its growth than would otherwise be the case, because we will need to be looking very carefully at what the assets and liabilities of various banks are. And perhaps we have been a bit lax for the smaller operators, such as, the shadow banks, the hedge funds, and the government here and the central bank is sort of looking at what they can do more in this respect to ensure that there is a bit of certainty there. And of course, we've actually had the Bank of England governor suggesting that perhaps the minimum deposits that are going to be or at the maximum that is there for your deposits that is going to be protected if something goes wrong with any banks is going to increase, which is good news, because lots of other countries are in a different position to us. So, you talked about the certainty and you referred to what I said before, but you're absolutely right. These are the sort of things that really matter. These are the sort of things that would attract investment. And you've seen what's going on the fintech side right now, things not looking too good. And the whole idea we're going to deregulate after Brexit and therefore have loads and loads more firms come and list here, particularly in the financial sector, seems to be something that perhaps isn't going to happen because of the conditions we're finding ourselves in.
And finally, Julian, if I can finish with you, I mean, what is your view of the role of the IMF, and do you think that they have a role in terms of policy across the world and with their forecasting? And how do you think our own government is going to respond, given that we have Westminster coming back tomorrow?
Well, I think with all these organisations, there are basically two things that they do. The most useful thing is doing economic analysis. So recently, for example, the IMF published what I thought was quite a good paper on the the long-term trend in interest rates. I think that analysis is helpful. It can sometimes be quite influential. Their economic forecasts, though, I think they're no better, no worse than many others. Interesting, Vicky mentioned the Office for Budget Responsibility. I think their forecasts are going to be even more wrong. In their March forecast, they were predicting that the UK economy would contract by 0.4% in the first quarter of this year. But based on the data we already have, it looks like it's going to expand by 0.2%. They're already out by perhaps 0.6%, which is a pretty big miss within just a month or two. So I think the danger is that you rely too much on these numbers. I think they're only guidelines, but if you set policy too rigorously on the basis of a single set of forecasts, particularly when we're talking about big decisions about tax and spend, which is how our fiscal rules are run, then you're at risk of getting into all sorts of doom loops and making massive policy mistakes.